The Hollow-Eyed Man. A childhood nightmare. The first time Olivia saw him, she was 6 years old. A storm had knocked the power out in her family's old farmhouse, and she lay in bed, staring at the flickering candlelight dancing on the walls. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the windows, and rain pattered against the roof like 1,000 tiny footsteps. She hated storms. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the walls of her room, seeping into every corner. The candle on her nightstand flickered, its glow barely holding the shadows at bay. Olivia gripped her blanket tightly, pulling it up to her chin, her small fingers trembling. Then she heard it, a soft shuffle. Her breath hitched. She turned her head toward the doorway, her heartbeat a drum in her ears. And that was when she saw him, standing just beyond the glow, half hidden in the shadows. A man, impossibly tall and thin, his skin stretched tightly over his bones, as if he had been starved for centuries. His clothes were tattered, clinging to his skeletal frame as though they had once been part of him. But it was his eyes, or the lack of them, that paralyzed her with fear. Where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, hollow sockets, black as the space between the stars. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only stood there, watching. The candle's flame trembled violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Olivia opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her tiny body shook as she yanked the blanket over her head, squeezing her eyes shut. She counted in her head, forcing herself to believe that if she just waited, he would disappear. 1, 2, 3. She peeked. He was closer. His hollow sockets bore into her, and this time she did scream. Her mother rushed in, her face pale with worry. "What is it, sweetheart?" Olivia pointed to the corner of the room, tears streaking down her cheeks. The man with no eyes." Her mother flicked on a flashlight, its bright beam cutting through the dark. Nothing was there. "There's no man here, honey, just a bad dream," she whispered, her voice soothing as she smoothed Olivia's hair. "Go back to sleep." But Olivia knew what she had seen, and she never forgot him. The shadow that never left. For weeks after that night, Olivia refused to sleep alone. Every evening she pleaded with her mother to leave the hallway light on, but even then she would wake to the sound of breathing, not her mother's, not her father's, something else. And sometimes she would hear faint tapping on her window, even on nights when the wind was still. Once she saw him outside. It was late, and she had dared to peek through the curtains. There, standing at the edge of the cornfield behind their house, was the hollow-eyed man. He was utterly motionless, his empty sockets locked onto her window. She wanted to call for her parents, but before she could make a sound, he lifted a skeletal hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at the house, at her. She let out a choked sob and fell backward onto the floor, scrambling away from the window. By the time her parents rushed in, he was gone. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Olivia could see the doubt in her eyes. That was the last time she spoke about him, even though she still felt his presence, even though she knew he was still watching. 15 years later, the farmhouse was a distant memory, tucked away in the corners of Olivia's mind like an old, faded photograph. She had moved to the city for college, then settled into a quiet life as a librarian, spending her days among dusty books and the comfort of silence. She told herself the hollow-eyed man had been a childhood nightmare, just a figment of her imagination. And yet some nights when she lay in bed and let the darkness settle around her, she swore she could still feel his presence. Watching, waiting. Then one evening she received a call. Her mother's voice was hushed, almost fearful. "Olivia, I think something is wrong with the house. I hear footsteps at night, whispers. And I see things. A cold weight settled in Olivia's stomach. It had been years since she last set foot in that house. She had sworn never to go back. But something in her mother's voice made her pack a bag and drive through the night. The House of Shadows. When she arrived, the farmhouse was exactly as she remembered, except for the feeling. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against her lungs like unseen hands. The walls seemed taller, the shadows deeper. The house loomed in the moonlight, its windows dark and empty. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face drawn and pale. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "He's here," she whispered. Olivia didn't ask who, she already knew. That night, she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, listening. The old wooden house creaked and groaned under the weight of time, but there was something else beneath the noise. Something deadly. Olivia didn't ask who, she already knew. That night, she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, listening. The old wooden house creaked and groaned under the weight of time, but there was something else beneath the noise, something deliberate. A whisper? A shuffle. A soft, almost rhythmic knock against the walls. And then the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate. Coming down the hall, the doorknob twisted, the door creaked open. And there he was. The hollow-eyed man stood in the doorway, his empty sockets locked onto hers. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The air around her grew colder, her breath turning to mist in the dim light. He raised a skeletal hand and pointed, not at her, at the wall. And suddenly, Olivia understood. A secret buried in the walls. The next morning, she forced herself to investigate. Her hands trembled as she helped her mother move furniture away from the old wooden panels. The whispers seemed to grow louder the closer they got. And then Olivia saw it, a section of the wall where the boards were newer, hastily nailed into place. She grabbed a hammer and pried them off. What she found made her stomach lurch. Behind the boards was a hidden space, and inside the remains of a man, a skeletal figure, its head tilted back in a silent scream. His eye sockets were empty. The hollow-eyed man had never been a ghost trying to harm her. He had been trying to be found. The enduring memory. Years later, Olivia sometimes thinks back to that house. The memories of the hollow-eyed man no longer fill her with fear. Instead, they remind her that sometimes ghosts don't haunt out of malice. Sometimes they just want to be heard. And sometimes they just want to go home.